Welcome to the Investor Voice, a KLAS Research podcast dedicated to helping our healthcare IT investor friends hear from industry experts and analysts to understand trends as well as the evolution and adoption of technology in healthcare. Hello, welcome to the Investor Voice, a KLAS Research podcast. I'm Justin Long, your host, Director of Investment Advisory Services here at KLAS Research. This podcast will focus on data and insights, as well as relevant topics for our healthcare IT investor. Today joining me is KLAS Research CEO, Adam Gale. Fortunate to get you to actually sit down and take a breath today, Adam. Thank you for joining me.
Well, it's Best in Class week. It's an exciting week, but good to be here with you, Justin.
Thank you. You know, I think a great place to start, KLAS has been celebrating its 25th year, and when we say 25 years or a quarter of a century, that's a long time. But I know you being one of the original founders, you established really a couple of things. One, a mission, which we eat, drink, and really breathe today, as well as some guiding principles. And one of those principles, maybe a good way to say that, a keystone principle, is putting the provider first in everything that we do. And I know that
Absolutely.
That rings loudly with all of our employees. Stating that, I know a lot of the healthcare organizations and people in healthcare, when they think of KLAS, they associate us really working deeply with vendors and providers, but they're quite surprised to hear that we do so much work with investors.
Yeah.
Do you mind maybe just sharing how our mission ultimately aligns with the healthcare investment community?
Yeah, our mission has a huge impact on how we think about the investment community. In fact, one of the reasons why we're probably not as well known in the investment community today is early on, we avoided investors. And that was funny because that was actually mission driven. We saw a couple of acquisitions where investors bought good assets in the healthcare IT space, and I would say just milked them, to get dollars out of it. And that was disappointing for us, and that was probably 20 plus years ago. But we thought, look, let's avoid the investment community because it felt like they were not going to be good actors in this. Well, that's changed 180 degrees for us. We see it today as our mission being connecting good companies to good dollars that will help them grow and thrive. And just two examples I've thought of. There was a technology company that had a big client base, acquired by an investment firm, and they had to make a decision were they going to put the dollars in to upgrade that to a new platform. And they did, and it was wildly successful. Lots of providers were super happy with the fact that they had a move forward plan. And we started to think a little differently. Then I saw a company where they'd been kind of putting along and doing pretty well. And then after they were acquired by a firm that put in new management that was innovative, energetic, just really, I think, drove the company forward. So we started to think, look, there's probably something here. We may have judged a little bit too early. But there's still, I think, for us, a filter of companies who have a long-term play and really want to make a company better, and those who just want to come, milk it and pull the cash out. So we try to work most with those that have that passion for the long-term win.
I think that's a great point. I mean, again, we want to work with, every vendor that or investor and or provider, obviously, but those that are really driven to move the market forward and bring better outcomes, right, to the industry. Yeah. And I think our investment community, for the most part, that are aligned and working with us, feel that. And that's really important, Adam. It wasn't very long ago, as you mentioned, investors have kind of become more of the KLAS, I'd say, ecosystem, maybe the last 5 years or so. Sure. And we're getting more and more traction as we work with them, and they feel like there's a great value with our relationship. But as we look at, it wasn't long ago, they may just reach out to us and purchase a report here and there, or, 3 or 4 every year, something along those lines. But what we found is the data that they're looking for is really key to their decision making, right? And as we've determined that, how do you feel like that data has helped develop maybe specific products for our investors?
Well, it's interesting because those reports that you referred to are typically built for the healthcare provider. Like, how do they have transparency into decisions that they're trying to make? And if you think about it, there's probably a secondary goal, which is helping the vendors see their gaps of where they can be better and see where they've done particularly well to, kind of put the pedal to the metal in those areas. So what hasn't happened is a place where you can take that data and flip it on its head for an investor and have the data essentially speak that language. And obviously these investors are data hungry, before they go make their decisions. So one of the things we've done is tried to take that satisfaction research, add on to it research around why people are buying, who else are they looking at, like what's the sort of tenor of decisions in the market. And I think that data has been fascinating, especially with a morphing market that we have today. And then I think the last piece to that is adding, I think, the color commentary. So that color commentary is taking all the conversations we've had, taking really bright people and turning that into a tapestry of thinking. And so I think shifting from just reading a KLAS report to having the KLAS team on the line to be able to ask those questions has been a pretty significant shift for us over the last several years.
Yeah, and investors, I think, would give a resounding absolutely. That's what we love to consume and digest. That commentary is just invaluable to them, as well as, like you mentioned, our experts. And we've seen really as one of these products, I think is a nice maybe prelude, is our membership, right? As members have now opportunity, investor members, that's grown significantly to have access to our experts, our analysts, consume not only these reports, but more the narrative behind the data, right, with that commentary. But in addition, we've had a greater demand from investors for our KLAS advisory services, more of that custom work. And in that demand, it's maybe you can kind of talk about what we've done to meet that and what are some of the resources we've opened up for this custom diligence work, specifically for our investors.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You think of the rest of the pieces of the ecosystem that the providers don't think as much about. And one of those is, like, what's the addressable market? How big is this opportunity? Who else are the other players broadly, not just ones that a provider would look at, but who else is pushing into the space from different directions? And those are the kind of the conversations that we'd like to have with the investment community. I mean, I think of that color commentary. I went to someone who had just acquired a big player several years ago, and I just asked the question, do you know what you just bought? And I know they'd done homework, so I don't want to discount the homework they'd done, but it's interesting because this was a system that was very prevalent in the market, but it felt like it was just about to tip. Like, a lot of folks were saying it was old, were starting to look at other players. They hadn't lost a lot of business yet, but we could see on the horizon lots of decisions that were moving that direction. And the buyer had not seen that. They'd seen the pitch from the vendor about how much of the market they owned and how they were really king of the castle. And it just was so painful to me to think of, okay, you thought you were buying this and you really got that. So any chance we can have to bring clarity to those discussions, I think it's our team really energized.
It's a great point. I hear that from investors all the time. I'm right. We're really helping discern reality versus perception. I think society today, there's a little bit of fluff, there's some embellishment, and at the end of the day, we want to validate for these investors, just like we do providers, right? What's fluff, what's reality, what's happening, to cite your example there. Maybe kind of taking that a little bit further, as I think about just a recent conversation with a large investment firm. We help in this custom diligence process, as you know, at different stages, right?
For sure.
Maybe very early stage, as they're maybe building out a thesis, looking to better understand maybe a market landscape, to market identification, they have a target that they're potentially looking at, to when they actually are in a process, right? But we just recently, and this is not common or uncommon, as you know, but we had an investor firm reach out to us and say, we just spent a boatload of money on a sizable custom diligence product, and they came to us at the midnight hour and say, we have 3 or 4 questions we were looking to get answers. We didn't get one of them answered. Can you help us? And really in a desperation mode. And obviously we didn't necessarily have 2 to 3 weeks, which we can turn around a project to do it. But in the short time that we had, we brought together our experts, some of these data sets, really, like you said, kind of got underneath some of the key story behind the data. And that firm came back and said, I wish we would have had you at the very beginning. And so those are the relationships we love to hear.
And we love that. We love when we can help, and we hate when it's like, look, if you'd called us 2 weeks ago, we'd have more we could share. And I think we really have 2 things that make us unique. The first is we have not just the data today of how people feel. We have how did they feel 6 months ago and a year ago and 5 years ago. So we can trend their competitors. We can trend how they're doing. We can trend the perception as well of non-customers about how they see the market. So we have just this historical sense. We also have an ability which is fun to be able to go call providers up. And without raising kind of a flag of like, hey, why are you calling me? We can throw in a couple of questions about, how do you feel about this? Or how do you think about that? And no one has kind of their radar going off saying, why are they asking me these questions? So it's fun. We can get just the real information where they don't have their guard up. And we can add those in, pretty quickly in some of these diligence processes.
Yeah, that's the custom, ability, right, to adapt and tailor to their needs. So thank you for sharing that. Maybe changing a little bit here, but as we talk about really validating the data for our investors, and also maybe another way of saying it, de-risking their opportunity, right? Because ultimately they're coming in and they're negotiating in if they're in the latter stage, right?
For sure.
And they don't want to overpay. They obviously want to get the most value for what they're going to buy, and then we're going to help them doing that. But we also have events, and a couple of them that stand out, as you know, that you participate in and are really a big proponent of, is our Digital Health Investment Symposium here domestically, then our International Summit, and a very similar format, but what we do is we're obviously aligning vendors, investors, and it's fair to say obviously providers in these settings. How do you feel as a CEO, just talk about the greatest value this is specifically to, I know it's to all parties, but really to the investors, if you don't mind.
I was pretty curious when we first started this 4 years ago, this DHIS summit, of how it would really play out. We had this thesis that if we did a mini JP Morgan, where you had the right people, a little smaller group, you didn't have to chase all through the city to connect with folks, that would be a great place. And adding to that just some real data of where the market really was. So the theory was great. We had our first event. It seemed like it was pretty good. And I sat down with a couple of the participants and I said, how was this? What did you take away from it? And they said, Adam, I can't think of any other place where we sit down at a table, investors like we are, vendors, providers, and technology companies that are big and small, and we take off our normal hats and we just have a discussion about how to solve things in the market. They said, I don't think I've ever been at an event that was quite that candid in terms of just getting the feedback of a group like that. And I thought, well, yeah, we kind of do that all the time. So it didn't seem that unique to me. But you're right, that's not normally what people would experience. So that was the first thing. The second thing is I can think of the event we had right before COVID. So probably 4 or 5 months before COVID, I looked around the room at sort of the who's who of, who was looking to buy, big strategic companies, investors who were looking to find the right kind of smaller companies and bigger companies, and just the people in the room. And I was in awe at the discussions that were going on. And I just sort of walked around the dinner and thought, oh man, I love that person. I hope they're able to connect with this person. And just, there's a smallness about it where it's, it was about 150, 200 people, where you can connect with most of the key people you want to in the room. Not everyone, but most, with a really meaty discussion. So I love the just sort of combination of who's in the room, what they know, and the fact that they can have just these really candid discussions. So that's on the domestic side. Internationally, we held our first event pre-COVID, of course. Sure. And again, it was amazing the people that came in from Australia, the UK, just a lot of unique voices that came together. And I've been to some international events, and they were pretty good, but they tend to be one region. Like, what region is it that we're talking about? This felt like it brought in a much broader region to talk about what's happening worldwide with healthcare IT. And we're really excited to hopefully have the next one here soon, part two.
Part two in June in Portugal. June. So not glass here, but hopefully we can look behind this COVID and actually hold this event. But as of now,
and I've not been to Portugal, so I'm ready. I am ready to get to Portugal.
I am as well, and I think hopefully our investors and everyone that will be participating. I know we have a sizable investment community that will be joining.
Yeah.
Or excuse me, provider and vendor community that will be joining that. So let's maybe, as we're have just a few more minutes here, I want to talk about emerging technology for a few minutes. It's customary for me to kind of end or come to a conclusion in these when I speak to our experts.
Yeah.
To ask them in their specific segment or category, what's emerging technology that's actually, getting hold or catching momentum, or maybe even highlight a vendor or two more generally speaking. we'll be more broad in our discussion here, obviously, Adam, but I know emerging technology is a real priority and focus for you as a CEO here at KLAS. Can you maybe just share with the audience why that's such a driving focus?
So I can say one of the drivers of this was a friend of mine I talked to several years ago, and they were over innovation at the health system that they were working with, and I'd talked to them for years, and they said, Adam, and he held up on this virtual call their best-in-class report and said, I've bought basically everything you have in here, one of everything, but now I'm getting 400 calls, texts, emails, in-person visits from these companies that I don't know what they do. I've never heard their names. I'm not sure if we should give them a second look. So Adam, help me with those 400. And I thought, okay, how do we do that? But we've taken steps the last 2 years to say, look, let's start to measure someone when they have their first 5 real customers or 10 real customers, and not wait for the normal KLAS bar, and at least give an early look in these emerging tech reports. So for me, it's been a thrill to just see how well these vendors are performing with those early clients, and even to answer a strange question in my mind, which is, what do you do?
Sure.
So, you have a new vendor come and you think, I've never heard of that. You read their website and you still think, I still don't know what you do exactly. Because I've read 100 vendors that say they do this same thing.
That's right.
So I can think of a few places that have gotten me the most enthusiastic. One that I think has a really interesting mix of players is the social determinants of health space. Like if you just think of how to help the most needy in the country, it's figuring out, okay, where are the food deserts? How are they going to get their transportation? What are the other needs that they have that are not in their normal medical record? And the vendors that are starting to offer those things. And oftentimes they're the vendors that you're like, is that a real vendor? I remember someone came into my office and said, hey, we just talked to Carrot Health. And I thought, is this a trick? Is this one of those tests of the CEO to see if he'll believe anything that someone brings in? And many of these vendors in the social determinant space have made early inroads, have figured out how to connect a network together where you can start to order an Uber, where you can start to figure out, oh, they're in a food desert, let's actually make an order for some food, or let's get Meals on Wheels in there. You think all the different options that they have. I love that, especially during COVID. It just seems like it's brought out some of these opportunities that these emerging vendors are starting to tackle in real ways.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, there was a few vendors we started with, and that turned into an entire segment, right?
Yeah.
That we've actually stood up.
Yeah.
As far as a measured and monitored group of vendors. From those spotlights, and for our audience that are familiar with those, it really is. It's a singular focused report on a solution or service that, as you mentioned, we're interviewing 5 to 15 or 20 of their customers, reporting back strengths and weaknesses, time to achieve outcomes, and some other key pieces. We won't go through the entire, obviously, structure of the report. But I know the question is probably looming out there from not only vendors, but even investors to say, what is the criteria to really be, not necessarily be measured, but to ultimately become a spotlight emerging tech KLAS report vendor?
Well, you can picture how many vendors call us and say, KLAS, I'd like to get on your radar. Like I just need my name in a report somewhere. And I'd love to show the world what we can do. And we just get lots of those requests. So our filter is not so much who calls us and asks for that. It is much more around the providers and who they bring up. So if you picture a normal phone call that we would have with a respondent, we'd ask them about, how well it works with this vendor and the other vendor that they have. And then at some point in the conversation, we shift to say, what are you working on? What are you trying to buy? What unique things have you seen that you'd like more information on? And we keep track of that. We figure out, what are they asking about? What new vendors are on the radar? And we try to proactively go measure those ones. And we find when we measure the ones that have the most impact, it just meets our mission. It just makes sure we're being transparent on the places that people care about versus chasing the dollars. There's a lot of companies that would pay us dollars to go rate them and have them on the radar.
You want some marketing, right, in essence?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the reality is that actually gets kind of boring. There was one that was just a marketing tool that said, we just go help folks market and get out in the market, and so you can know the provider better. And it was a little hokey what they were talking about. And I thought, look, if we have the KLAS team calling and asking about this, they're going to think this is how we're helping the market. Like this is what we do as our mission. So it's much more energizing when we go dig into meaty things. Like I think of Olive. We got introduced to Olive by a number of providers who said, look, I'm so pumped about their AI tool. So we called Olive and they said, well, we don't, like that's not who we are. Like we're not an AI tool company. We deliver these kind of results. And that shifted how we thought about it. So when we published on Olive, it changed from this is not an AI tool to this is what they really are. This is what providers really say. And it was fun to be on sort of the front edge of the Olive push and the RPA push to understand that market.
No, that's great feedback. And I know there's a huge demand for these reports for investors. And it's not necessarily the early stage, maybe VCs or smaller private equity. It's the large PE firms as well, because you hit the nail on the head. And I think that's important for our investment community to hear. These are areas that are influenced by providers, right? These are vendors that are actually being utilized or they want to know more about. And that's really important investment thesis build out for our private equity, larger firms as well. So I know we're at our time here, so I maybe just would pose this question before we conclude. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe is there any parting words or maybe a message you would like to share with those that are listening today, potentially watching this podcast, Adam?
You know, the key thing that comes to mind for me is the key role that they play as investors in this space. I think of those 400 emerging technology companies, how are they going to become the players of tomorrow? I think of who those players were 20 years ago. That was Athena Health. That was eClinicalWorks. You know, you just walk down the list. I remember calling Epic when they were first in our report and saying, who are you? Like we had no idea who they were. And Judy Faulkner says back to us, who are you? and so just being on the front edge of these and measuring them as they start to make some progress in the market, we hope we can help speed that up. And investors play a key role in helping those companies not die on the vine and helping the right companies, you know, move forward. So I'd say we've moved 180 degrees from where we were early on, where we would say, look, investors stay out of the market, where we would now say, look, if you have a long-term thesis and think you can help drive healthcare forward, we love to have your entrance and we love to have you participate in helping fund some of these players that we think really will change the market.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think that's great clarity to the investors that are maybe new in working with KLAS or prospective that are hearing about KLAS and really our capabilities and what we're looking to do, not only to drive the market, but support them in really contributing. Putting the right dollars is really what you're saying, right? With the right investments to achieve a better outcome for really all of us that are in healthcare. For the investor community that is listening, if you have any questions today about our discussion with Adam Gale, specifically around custom diligence, how we can support you early stage, later stage, or you're under an LOI or in the deal process, we're happy to share more insights and ultimately the door is open to support you with your needs. If there are other questions that relate to our data and insights around any of the segments or categories that KLAS measures and monitors, I think we're close to about 130 plus the last I heard. Feel free to send an email to investorservices@KLASresearch.com. Until our next episode, which will be on the payer category, we're going to leave a little bit of a mystery there for our listening audience. This is Justin Long with the Investor Voice, signing off.